So if we're talking about linguistics, in linguistics they talk about words and clauses and sentences, but what are the basic categories if we're talking a multimodality?
Well, some of the, we don't, of course, if you're in multimodality, you can still look at words and clauses and sentences and paragraphs, but you might want to have much more general terms which will apply to image as much as they do to writing, to gesture as much as it does to speech. And some of the basic categories that we will talk about, and we can do that now, are mode, of course. Think about the notion, instead of having a term such as language, have a more general term such as semiotic resources. And then what can these things do, which we talk about as affordance. And of course, where in linguistics maybe the sentence is the basic unit, in multimodality, in a semiotic kind of approach, we might talk about sign.
Okay, so to explain me about what exactly then is mode?
Mode is a term that allows us to get away from using language for everything. Whereas you might say there's visual language and there's gestural language and there's language of flowers, we now say there are different modes, and modes are resources whereby we can make meaning material. I want to mean something, I want to communicate something. How do I make my meaning evident, material, so others can kind of take it in, see it, hear it, maybe even touch it? And modes are these things which are socially produced, and they become cultural resources for making meaning. They're regular because a community uses these resources over long periods of time in similar kinds of circumstances. So there's a regularity that applies to them. They are material. They have sound, or they have image like that, or they're tactile, or they even smell, I suppose. And so modes are these things which a culture has as means of making meaning, and it allows us to get away from making language too general and maybe therefore too vague a term to be useful.
Okay, so we have this website here.
Okay.
What would then be mode if we're looking at this website?
Well, on that BBC homepage, news, you have a kind of a band at the top, which is in a dark red colour. Then underneath there is a kind of a lot of white. So colour is obviously important in some way. And we'd have to say, is colour significant? Is meaning being made with colour? In the broad band at the top, there's also something which people who know the BBC will recognise as a logo. So there's an image even in the broad band there. And is image important? But of course, then when you go below it to this big, basically white space, what you have is kind of chunks of stuff. You have modules of meaning. And these modules of meaning here seem to be made up of bits of writing, which are next to or underneath an image. So you have image and writing. You have color. So those would be the main modes. And then the question, I suppose, that would appear after a little while of kind of going into this is to say, is image more important than writing, or is writing more important, or do they do the same job, or do they do different kinds of jobs? So that's how I would begin to make my inroads into understanding how this website functions. Okay,
and earlier you mentioned semiotic resources.
Yeah.
What is a semiotic resource then?
It's a general way, again, of saying, what does the culture make available for us to make our meanings with? Semiotic is about meaning, resources for making meaning. And saying semiotic resources is a way of not making it necessary to list a whole long list of things that the culture has, but it says there are many, and all of them have potentials for making meanings in particular ways.
Okay, so in this sense, the different modes you're talking, like image and the writing and the color, are different semiotic resources that they have made use of?
I might have mentioned when we started this little conversation that we're assuming that all these semiotic resources are capable of making meaning, but not in the same way. So an image, for instance, doesn't have words. It doesn't have paragraphs. writing does have words and has sentences and paragraphs. And the question then is, what can you do with writing? What does writing afford? What does it make possible to do? So, for instance, outside at the moment, the weather is a bit kind of moist, and you know, we say it's raining. We don't know what the it is that is raining, but language kind of forces us into kind of saying something is raining. But if I had an image here, I would just have a rainy day.
Okay.
It might be evident what it is. It does things, but does them differently, and the difference is significant. So affordance of a mode is an important issue, because we're saying these are not just repetitions, they're not just parallel, they're not just the same thing done differently, but rather they are they allow us to do somewhat different things in relation to a similar kind of issue. So it's raining, writing does it in one way, image does it in another way, but we could have a sound recording of rain on a roof or on a surface or something like that. So it allows us to make kinds of combinations of things which together make a richer meaning or a fuller meaning that a single mode by itself would enable us to do.
So that's the reason, for example, why we have the text and the colors, the images.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. For instance, there it says 6 soldiers killed in Afghan blast. And the writing will give us a little bit of information about what happened on that day in Afghanistan. The image is an image of a tank with soldiers kind of standing on it. What does that image do? Well, it immediately kind of transports us into an arid landscape, a huge tank which takes up just about most of the image, these people in battle fatigues, and a different kind of meaning being made by each of those components, and yet they kind of come together and give us an overall sense of what's going on there.
And the last term you mentioned was sign.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit more
Well,
for me?
if you spoke to the man or the woman in the street and said, "What's language about?" they'd say words and sentences, probably. In other words, people have a kind of a common sense about what are the units of language, words and sentences. When we're thinking about many modes, gesture doesn't have words, image doesn't have word, music only when it's sung has words, but it has melody. It has different kinds of entities, and so the question is, what is a common kind of thing to all of these things? All of these things make meaning, and the entity of meaning that we use, let's say in multimodality, not everybody, but people who have a semiotic approach, is the sign. The sign is a combination of a form and a meaning. So here, for instance, we have a tank. That's the kind of form that means might, power, violence, whatever. Yeah, so the sign is the basic unit which is common in the semiotic approach to all attempts to understand what meaning is being made. Now here, for instance, you have writing and you have image. So you have the signs made in writing, you have the signs made in image, color comes into it, the arid color of the image we've got there. So all of these are signs, and we can ask what is the form which is being used here, and what is the meaning which is being attached to the form. That's what the sign is about.